Greta Thunberg, what other, at the time, 16-year-old Swedish girl, got famous so quickly and talked about so much in international media? To be honest, I don't think I've ever seen anyone so quickly rise in popularity for such a simple and utterly meaningless task of not going to school. But hey, this is just the start of the video. Let's not be too harsh already. After all, I'm sure she has a quantifiable impact and makes the world a better place in objective terms. I mean, she does, after all, talk about climate change. That counts, right? Oh, and she's also a Nobel Prize nominee because she talks, I guess, and doesn't go to school. Oh, and apparently she can see CO2 with the naked eye. That one always cracks me up. Alright, anyway. Hello, YouTube. My name is Sandre, and well, welcome to my video on Greta. Now, before we begin though, let me just make this clear. Anyone who is watching this video right now and just instinctively clicks on dislike just because I'm critical of Greta and wants to post some comment about how I am supposedly a climate denier or some shit, just keep in mind that you will look like a fucking dumbass because I've made numerous videos debunking other YouTubers who deny that climate change is a thing. People who deny that the Earth is getting warmer and that humans are the cause of this warming. At least the overwhelming majority of it. You see, if you look at my username, you're gonna notice something. It says Sandre the Teacher. And if you look at my channel, you're going to see my description where it says that I actually work part-time as a high school chemistry teacher. I am the first one to tell you that yeah, humans need to stop burning fossil fuels to prevent climate change from getting out of hand. Climate change is a big deal and it needs to be dealt with. However, because I actually do understand the science of this, my opinion is that we need to go about it in a sensible manner and go with scientific solutions that have actually proven to work. And there's a select few people that I really despise when it comes to climate change hysteria, which is the opposite of climate change denialism. Just like climate change deniers are a real problem, climate change hysterics are an equal amount of problem as well. One side denies climate change entirely, or at least partially. The other side blows it way out of proportion and makes it seem like climate change is going to lead to an apocalyptic scenario and we're all going to fucking die, which is not really true. Some of these people are Al Gore, whose 2006 movie, An Inconvenient Truth, actually is riddled by several scientific inaccuracies, and Al Gore should not be taken seriously by anyone. Same thing with AOC, who has made numerous dumb remarks regarding the climate. I actually made a video responding to her on her claims of tornadoes apparently getting more common in the Washington, D.C. area because of climate change, which is simply not true, and really shows you how either she is really ignorant on the science of this stuff, or she just doesn't care and just tries to get an emotional reaction out of people for her own political career. Regardless of which option it is, I find it very distasteful. And it's not something I want to promote, but rather it is something I want to work against. And Greta belongs to these people who are climate hysterics. Like I said, climate change is a real problem. But I go through what kind of problem it is in my videos responding to climate change deniers, and I suggest you watch those videos because you're going to notice one thing. I am actually very sensible and I look at the evidence. And I do not exaggerate in one direction or another. Because in science, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to follow the evidence, period. And I expect you as a viewer, even if you like Greta Thunberg, to watch my videos and click the links that I've linked and look at the record yourself. Greta is not a saint. In fact, there's really nothing special about her at all except for her autism diagnosis, which, by the way, I have as well. Yeah, I have Asperger's like Greta Thunberg, so I happily await all of your comments writing about how I'm some kind of fucking spurgy autist or some shit. Seriously though, I do love I do love memes about me. Anyway, moving on. So why is Greta famous? Well, she striked from school. Now, of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, but on its surface, that is the reason she became famous. In August of 2018, Thunberg took her activism public. Armed with a simple black and white sign, she started skipping school to strike in front of the Swedish parliament ahead of elections there. School kids around the world quickly started organizing their own strikes. It makes me feel good that I'm not alone in this fight, and it feels like my life has gotten some kind of meaning lately, Thunberg told the BBC. She's definitely no longer alone. Last month, organizers estimate some 4 million people mobilized for the September 20th global climate strike. Well, it's quite amazing actually how far this young lady has been propelled into famehood by her environment. She has talked to the UN.
How dare you!
She has sat down with world leaders. And she's even been nominated for a Nobel Prize. Tell me, where will it stop? Because I sure as hell don't know. Now, with the basic introduction out of the way, let's go deep into why some of the suggestions of her and what she thinks doesn't really jive with reality. Now, I don't really blame Greta for being in favor of heavy carbon taxes to curb emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. In fact, a lot of people are for heavy carbon taxes. In fact, so am I. So, you may wonder now, why am I bringing this up? Well, the reason is, even though I am for carbon taxes as well, I have to be honest that they're not as effective at cutting emissions as some people may think. And definitely not as effective as people like Greta make them out to be. Don't get me wrong, there is an impact by them, but the idea that heavy carbon taxes themselves are going to have a huge impact is a pipe dream. And don't take my word for it. If we look at Sweden, which is one of those nations that's held on a pedestal because of how well it's doing in fighting emissions and climate change, and trust me, I know all about that. I actually live here right now. What we find when we look at the data of CO2 emissions is that ever since carbon taxes have been implemented, and keep in mind Sweden has some of the most drastic ones in the world, emissions have only dropped about 11%. Now, don't get me wrong, 11% is a noticeable difference. It's definitely something. It's not nearly enough though. Clearly, carbon taxes themselves are not really the solution to cutting emissions. That's not to say that they can't be a useful tool. I think so myself, and I am very much in favor of them. But you also have to think about how you implement them and which demographic you're going after. Not only that, but the tax revenue that you do get while this tax is being paid, what do you do with that revenue? Where is the money going? Well, it doesn't really seem to benefit most common people. Ordinary working class families that may be dependent on their vehicle may see, and many have seen, their life quality getting lowered because of these heavy carbon taxes. Again, not necessarily because of these taxes themselves, but rather because of how they are implemented. In fact, the carbon tax in France was so bad that under Macron's government, there was a huge riot that started in 2018 and is still going on in many parts of France. Of course, these riots were not caused just by these carbon taxes, but the carbon taxes were definitely the catalyst. And there are numerous examples to show that working class families do suffer if you implement carbon taxes too heavily and in the wrong demographics. Because let's be honest here, not everyone in a society is equally guilty of emitting CO2. In fact, the richest 10% emit about 4 times more than the bottom 50%. So let me ask you, is it really fair to expect a working class family that has to use their vehicle for everyday or work purposes to be paying a fee that to a family with twice the income is really not a big deal at all. I don't think it's fair at all, which is one of the reasons why you're having the riots right now. Again, carbon taxes are a good idea and they should be implemented, but you need to be careful as to who is paying this carbon tax and who isn't. If you are going to implement a carbon tax for individuals in a society, why not tax the people who earn the most, and the people who simply are victims of their circumstances and are dependent on their vehicle and don't really have an option? Shouldn't they at least get to pay the least? To me, and to many people, it seems like people who are poor are punished, well, because they're poor. And to me, that's unacceptable. And even though you have these drastic heavy carbon taxes in many Western nations, there is a noticeable lack of new reforms and projects being implemented in these nations to deal with climate change. Isn't that odd? With all of its tax revenue, wouldn't you expect the governments in these nations to have ample supplies of revenue to basically deal with climate change now? Instead, what you find is that a lot of Western nations have a collapsing infrastructure and an over-reliance on oil, and it's not changing. I know I sound like a broken record because I've said this before so many times already. This is not the fault of carbon taxes, nor am I against carbon taxes. But let's be honest, when we look at the objective data, the way they are implemented for the most part doesn't really work. And it only leads to a system that stigmatizes and even punishes people who happen to be in a certain economic demographic, while it's hardly a bother at all to people in the higher echelons of the economy. This honestly needs to change. Besides, we still haven't talked about the elephant in the room. Why not tax the companies that are guilty of the overwhelming majority of the releases of CO2 and other greenhouse gases? Why even bother with individuals in a society when most of those individuals have no power or say as to the infrastructure and its makeup? Just some food for thought. Another talking point that Greta made a big deal about was flying, because whenever you go to Gran Canaria on your holiday, you're apparently committing the equivalence of murdering a baby seal with a club. And to be perfectly honest, I am sick and tired of this idea that people flying somewhere for a holiday, which is probably max 2 times a year, if even that, is honestly a bad thing. Sure, pound for pound, an airplane releases more CO2 than any car or truck. But the facts are that flying only accounts for about 2% of human emissions of CO2, and only 12% of emissions from transport. Let's compare that to road traffic. Road traffic accounts for about 16% of human emissions of CO2, and almost 75% of transport emissions. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was a politician and I really wanted to do something about climate change and reduce emissions, I wouldn't focus so much on that 2% of human emissions of CO2. Instead, I would focus on the 16%, because that's where you make the bigger difference. A CO2 molecule created in a combustion engine is 8 times more likely to come from a tailpipe than an airplane wing. So let me just make this clear to anyone who's watching this. From all the fear-mongering that you people heard about how apparently maybe this year you shouldn't go flying somewhere because you want to be nice to the environment, tell the fear-mongers to fuck off. If you want to take that flight to Hawaii for 2 weeks, go ahead. By all means, do. Chances are, most people are only going to take at most 2 of those trips every year. Many people only go on 1 trip per year. Hell, there's a lot of people who can't even go on one of these trips to begin with. Now, am I saying that we shouldn't fly less? No. If we can fly less, we should. Just like if we can drive less, we should. But what I am saying is, if you really want to make a difference, which one of these numbers should you focus more on? The 2% number or the 16% number? Because I know which one I would go for. And the amazing thing is, if we go buy electric vehicles, we can eliminate that 16%. That 2% from airplanes, though, is kind of hard because, well, electric airplanes are not really feasible and will not be technologically feasible for at least another 50 years or so. However, we already have more of an advanced enough technology to create capable electric vehicles and trucks. But more on that later. So instead of taxing the hell out of people for simply wanting to fly, or shaming people who just want to go somewhere nice on vacation, how about you focus on the actual bigger number that is way more of a big deal, and thereby prove that you're actually legit when you say you want to fix the problem? Yet another talking point by Greta is that she's a vegan, and that she doesn't eat meat, and therefore she claims that a meat-free diet is always more climate-friendly. Well, research actually shows that this is not true. In many circumstances, being a vegan can actually be more detrimental to the environment than simply eating meat. Now, I should add, though, that I'm not talking about all types of meat here. If you like red meat, like beef or pork, yes, eating these types of meat can actually make you more of a liability for climate ecology than eating as a vegan or a vegetarian. However, simply reducing that meat a little bit and eating more white meat, like chicken for instance, has been shown in research to actually, in many cases, be more climate friendly than strictly going vegan. It's not that people need to eat less meat in total, or maybe no meat at all. It's that people are eating too much of certain types of meat, and all they need to do to become as climate friendly as you is to simply diversify the types of meat that they're eating. For instance, instead of the only fish you're eating to be salmon, maybe sometimes you should mix it up and have some mackerel. The food chain can actually sustain about 10 times more mackerel than the population of salmon. This holds true for other types of meat as well. A chicken is over 100 times more sustainable than a cow. Now, let's get into something more serious, and that's Greta's relationship to Justin Trudeau. For those who don't know, Justin Trudeau is planning on building a pipeline through Canada. And when meeting Greta Thunberg, he decided that he would pledge to use money from oil pipelines to plant trees. Well, isn't that just peachy? There's one problem though. Well, actually there's 3 of them, but let's go through them in order. 1. Pipelines are notorious to spilling. In the United States, a pipeline spill occurs nearly every day, with over 1,400 accidents in America between 2010 and 2013. Historian Sean Carrage has recently demonstrated that even a pipeline that has operated with a 99.999% success rate in Canada has averaged a spill and a half a year and discharged about 5.8 million liters of oil over the past 40 years. A very low failure rate. However, as you can see, due to the heavy volumes of oil being transported, it still causes heavy environmental damage. So as we can see, the risk of contamination of soil and groundwater due to leakage from a pipeline, which is going to be as long as the one that's planned, is a real thing. And this will affect the immediate area, which is the reservations. Many people could fall ill or even die thanks to poisoning and other toxic effects. However, spilling is not the only issue that's being brought up here by these oil pipelines. Natives may be forced off their land. Pipelines require a large area to function. They are very long. They also act as a divider in the landscape. Now, since pipelines are very expensive, you want to make them as straight as possible. And the Canadian government has shown that even though that means that you have to cut it straight through a town or a reservation, the government doesn't care. And may I just point out that Canada already doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to treating their indigenous population well. In fact, many of the indigenous populations of Canada live in what in other parts of Canada would be called squalor. It's also clear that this pipeline may actually be in direct contradiction to many of the treaties that have been signed between the Canadian government and the Indian tribes. Now, what's going to happen to the natives thanks to this pipeline? I don't know, and no one really does. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, when it comes to Justin Trudeau apparently planting a couple of trees to try and offset the emissions that's going to be due to this pipeline, do I really need to tell people how ridiculous this notion is? Okay, well, I guess I do. You see, when trees grow, they bind a lot of carbon. Plants have leaves, and the leaves have something called the stomata. When the stomata is open, the leaves can actually absorb carbon dioxide through the stomata. And as you know from learning about photosynthesis in school, carbon dioxide is nourishment for plant life. The carbon dioxide molecules are converted into everything from fuel for the plant during nighttime or building materials for the plant to grow. It should not come as a surprise then that most of the binding of carbon dioxide in a plant's life is during the time when it grows the most. When, let's say, a tree has reached the height it can possibly ever reach, it can't really grow much more in any way. At that point, it only absorbs carbon dioxide primarily to sustain its already big size, but not to grow further. Maybe at this point some of you can put two and two together and realize that trees are really only very effective at binding carbon dioxide when they are growing. In order to offset the carbon dioxide that would be released thanks to the easy accessibility of the oil that's going to be transported in this pipeline, not only would you have to do a one-time plantation of trees, you would have to plant trees over and over again. In fact, you would have to do that every day. You know the recent project where a bunch of YouTubers like Mr. Beast, for instance, campaigned for people to donate about $20 million so they could plant 20 million trees. It's a noble goal, to be sure, but ultimately ineffective. In fact, you would need to plant 40 million trees every single day just to offset the carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by the US alone. If you want to know more about these numbers, I recommend a video made by Thunderfoot, which goes into great detail on this. Looking at these 3 points that I've mentioned now regarding Greta meeting and befriending Justin Trudeau, it's pretty clear that Greta should not greet Justin Trudeau as a friend. And if Greta and the people who support her are serious about climate change or any other type of environmental activism, they wouldn't smile and praise Justin Trudeau. They would scream at him from the top of their lungs, because he is actually one of those people who actually deserves their outrage. Oh, and by the way, Extinction Rebellion, if you're watching, these people are just trying to get to work, okay? Don't yell at them. You see, this asshole, who is actually a danger to the Canadian environment and our atmosphere as a whole, yeah, you should bother him, okay? How about you guys glue yourselves together, as you like to do, to common traffic and form a human raft and just, sail over to Canada and harass Justin Trudeau instead? If you guys actually did that, I would actually respect you guys more. Now, we have gone through to some extent now as to what Greta is preaching. But is she practicing what she's preaching? It doesn't take more than a shallow glance to realize that no, she is not. One of the biggest media events regarding Greta was in the middle of last year. In August of 2019, Greta Thunberg set sail for New York. At this point, she had totally given up flying as a way to save emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. But anyone who knows how to do basic math will realize that this journey of hers wasn't as carbon neutral as she wants you to believe. She traveled in a yacht, and it was fitted with solar panels and underwater turbines that produced electricity on board. It was not equipped with any toilets, kitchen, or any kind of extra room for privacy even. From these factors, it may seem like, yeah, this should be pretty carbon neutral, right? After all, since ancient times, people have been using just the wind to sail entire oceans. You see, the ironic thing about this speedy little yacht that Greta was on is that it's supposed to prevent any emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere, but its production is entirely dependent on it. You see, this yacht was not just some fast yacht, it's actually a professional racing yacht, made out of carbon fiber. In fact, it was made out of 3 tons of carbon fiber. Now, to be fair, some of the carbon fiber on this boat was indeed reused from previous boats. However, in order to make a safe boat, you still need to produce a majority new carbon fiber, and not just rely on 100% recycled ones. And carbon fiber is not clean by any means. In order to manufacture 1 ton of carbon fiber, you have to emit about 20 tons of CO2. That's how wasteful the process of making carbon fiber is. And not only that, almost a third of the carbon fiber sheets actually end up on the factory floors. And not all of the carbon fiber can be recycled. Now, if this was a boat that was meant to last for decades, this really wouldn't be that big of a deal. After all, you have to emit some CO2 to produce most products, to be honest. The problem here, though, is that these racing yachts don't have a very long life. You see, these boats may be manufactured to take a beating on the sea, but people don't realize just what kind of beating that a boat like this can take. And even if it's made out of a strong, light material like carbon fiber, a boat that experiences too many races is eventually going to have to be retired. Again, you can recycle some of the carbon fiber, but not all of it, which means that making these racing boats is a very wasteful process, which is not carbon neutral at all. And honestly, anyone who cares about the environment and climate change and has any kind of knowledge about the science of recyclability should be offended that she chose to travel across the Atlantic in a yacht that is anything but climate friendly. Oh, and it gets worse. You see, Greta may have made a choice not to fly anywhere, but her shipmates did not make that promise. And 2 of the crew had to fly to New York to bring the boat back to Europe. Which means that overall, if you consider the manufacturing of the boat, as well as the fact that 2 crew members had to fly to transport the boat back, from the viewpoint of saving CO2 emissions, this journey was a fucking disaster. And I, who actually cares about climate change, am kind of pissed off to read about this. And it's pretty clear to anyone who's knowledgeable about this that this is nothing more than a media stunt. No good comes out of this, except for more publicity for Greta. However, while Greta is chastising people who dare to fly maybe twice a year, and she thinks of herself as such a goody two-shoes since she doesn't actually fly, the fact is, that doesn't mean that Greta is not contributing massive amounts of CO2 emissions. In fact, she is. Now, when she travels to most places, it is by train, which to be fair is a very environmentally friendly way of traveling. Train travel generates about 15 grams of CO2 per kilometer, which is very much less than air travel, which generates about 100 grams of CO2 per kilometer. However, most people who take the train, or even the flight, they go to a destination, and they stay there, and then they go back the same way they came. So on average, the emissions are equal to the distance traveled times 2, times the average emission per kilometer. For Greta, though, that's not the case. Greta travels a lot. And like I said, she may be traveling with train for the most part, which is environmentally friendly, but that doesn't change the fact that all these trips together add up. And considering how much she's traveling, she's emitting many times more CO2 than most people do in a year, in a single week. And you know what? If Greta thinks she has the right to shame people for flying maybe once or twice a year, I think that gives us the right to shame her for traveling everywhere when she's actually supposed to be in school. So with all the traveling and all the grandstanding that Greta has done, has any good come out of this? Is there any real reform of any kind that we can look to as a result of her activism? After all, she's been doing this now for over a year. After all, she's become a damn icon for the environmentalist movement. Well, none so far. For all of the posturing, taking pictures with world leaders, asking world leaders, and demanding things from world leaders, nothing concrete has actually come so far, at all. And so, one has to reach the natural conclusion that most of the activism that Greta engages in is nothing more than theater. But why wouldn't it be? I mean, think about it, people. This is a girl who became famous and put on a damn pedestal just because she didn't want to go to school. It's funny to me how people who support Greta and think she's actually making a difference in the world, on one hand talk about these massive oil companies that lobby the governments of the world and keep renewable energy technology away from the populace for their own capital gain, which is true, by the way. Yet, while they believe that these powerful institutions are doing this, they also seem to believe that a 16 or 17-year-old girl merely being a bit sardonic and telling off some people at a meeting and talking to some world leaders is going to change things? That this somehow makes her quote-unquote brave? Give me a fucking break. There's nothing revolutionary about what Greta is doing, nor is there anything brave about it. Greta is not fixing the problem, but she may actually end up aiding it in the long run. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. Companies have, throughout the decades, taken any opportunity they can to get good publicity, to make it seem like they're dealing with emission or other environmental issues. And time again, it turns out that no, that's not the case. They've just been lying to the public yet again. They made it seem like they were making a change, But they weren't. Let's take a look at some examples. Coca-Cola is one of the climate change conference sponsors, and in the profile of our conference's website, the company claims it has an enduring commitment to building sustainable communities and is focused on programs that reduce its environmental footprint. But Coca-Cola is not actually environmentally friendly. There are multiple examples. In India and Latin America, Coca-Cola took away water from farmlands in drought-ridden areas of India and Latin America. This was because Coke was opening up bottling plants, and as such, they used up the water in the area where the farmers were and crippled their ability to grow and feed themselves. Even back home in the States, Coca-Cola does some real fuckery. They, alongside other soda companies that make bottled water, have been caught tapping into aquifers as well as stream water to produce their bottled water in some of the most drought-ridden areas of California. Sometimes they took the water even from national forests. That is low. Volkswagen is a car manufacturer that for a long time have sold themselves as one of the more environmentally friendly car makers. They, alongside other car brands, donated to and took part in environmental campaigns to give themselves the appearance of caring about our atmosphere and the air we breathe. However, they were caught by the California Air Resources Board with having a software installed in their cars that would cheat certain emission tests. And it could then subsequently choose if it was going to release more or less nitrogen compounds. This meant that customers who bought a Volkswagen thought they bought a car that didn't release a lot of nitrogen oxides that are very toxic. But in reality, their cars were some of the worst offenders, having very high levels of nitrogen oxides released into the atmosphere. The Climate Change Conference consulted with BP Oil, which is, as you guessed, an oil company. Now, that in of itself is kind of ironic, but in this case, it's especially distasteful, because on April 20th of 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, owned by BP Oil, began spewing 4.9 million barrels of oil into the ocean. The gushing continued for almost 90 days, and it caused the largest accidental oil spill in the history of the oil industry. The same way you have companies now trying to cozy up to Greta just because they want the good publicity. But I promise you, these companies have not actually changed. And as long as they can get away with this, they're not going to. However, this time, since we have the clout of being around Greta, people are not going to suspect them as much. With all of the things that we've gone through, it's pretty clear that Greta is not being honest. But to be fair to her, I don't think she is the worst part of this equation. I think the people around her are. Now, this is not me taking away any accountability on her part, of course. She should still be held responsible for the things she says and does. However, I think it's pretty clear that she alone cannot be blamed. And in fact, most of the blame should fall on the people around her, like her parents. Have you ever wondered about something when it comes to Greta? No matter where she is, she's always reading from a script. And when she's reading from a script, she can be very passionate. But as soon as she's expected to not talk from a script, she doesn't really succeed in, communicating too well. This is because she doesn't really have any original opinions, and nothing she has said on this topic is original in any way. Very little of what she says and does is because of her own volition, and she is in fact nothing more than a puppet being stringed along. A very good indication of this is the fact that it turned out that, well, the posts by her on social media weren't actually by her at all, but actually by her parents, meaning that they have an extensive control, which means that they have an extensive control and oversight over most of her communications with the outside world. But then again, if you think that Greta's rise to fame is entirely due to her having some kind of amazing charisma, you're deluded. Who are Greta's parents? Well, Greta's mother is the opera singer Malena Ernman, and her father is the actor Svante Thunberg. And throughout their adult life, both parents have been known to be active when it comes to environmental activism. And considering that they are both very successful people in media, it starts to become clear now how Greta became famous. Oh, but the rabbit hole doesn't stop there. We know that her activism is funded by a myriad of corporate foundations. Many of these companies are known for their support of regime change around the globe. They also engage in special interest lobbying, and some of these companies are also known to use their lobbyism to prevent legal procedures that are meant to protect human rights and whatnot. Honestly, I could go on, but it would take too long. But trust me, this is only the beginning of the rabbit hole. Now, like I said before at the beginning of this video, climate change is real. And the warming that we're seeing, it's not natural. Sure, it is true that the Earth has periods where it gets cooler and it gets warmer, and these are natural, and they happen all the time throughout Earth's history. However, never have we seen a change in temperature which is this rapid. It's not the Earth itself getting warmer that is worrisome. This happens throughout Earth's history, but it's the rate at which it's happening. And guess what? Us humans releasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are to blame. We are speeding up this process significantly. If you're denying climate change at this point, then I think you're pretty silly. Polar ice caps are melting. The glaciers are melting. Weather patterns are changing. We have record heat waves year after year, and they're becoming more frequent. And foreign species are migrating either further south or further north, depending on the hemisphere. This is not normal. Changes like this are not supposed to be this rapid. So make no mistake, climate change is real. However, like I also said at the beginning of this video, there are solutions to climate change. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of engaging with the dumb suggestions that you see from a lot of environmentalist activists, I'm going to mention a couple of things that we can do, and which is also not that time-consuming, and relatively easy for governments as well as companies to do, if we just have the willpower to do it. So the following things that I'm going to mention are realistic things that we can do, and do relatively quickly, and actually see a result relatively quickly. We can keep and expand nuclear power. Some proponents say that it's the future form of energy, and I have to disagree. But with all of these things said, I still realize that we need nuclear power, at least for the nearest decades. If we don't have nuclear power to rely on for the next 30 or 40 years, there's no way that we can cut down on fossil fuel as quickly as we need to cut down on emissions. Another solution is that we can install renewable power stations that make sense in the area. What I mean by this is, in areas where you have a lot of wind, it makes sense to have wind power plants. In areas where you have a lot of sun, it makes sense to have solar power plants. Let's take the US as an example. A huge area of the US is actually desert, which, as you might have guessed, has a lot of sunlight. And despite what you may have heard or read, solar power is actually really efficient these days. The US could get a substantial part of its energy needs met by simply installing a lot of solar power plants in the deserts of the US. All you need is the willpower to do so. But sadly, on one hand, there seems to be this irrational distrust of solar power, as well as a huge oil and coal lobbying industry, doing its damnedest to prevent formation of renewable power plants, especially in the US. Another solution is to crack down on the 100 companies that release about 70% of all emissions. Yes, for all you may have heard about how you as an individual can apparently save the world by just changing a few things in your everyday life, such as taking the bus instead of driving your car and whatever, the truth is, 100 companies in the world release about 70% of all human emissions of CO2. So let me ask you, should the main burden really fall on you as an individual? Or should it perhaps fall on these companies? With a large enough grassroots movement, people could actually force governments to, well, enact reforms that would make these companies change their ways to release less CO2. It's going to be hard, but it can be done. Another solution is to incentivize buying electric cars and update the infrastructure to enable driving electric further, as 16% of human emissions are from road traffic. Yes, think about that, people. 16% of human emissions are from road traffic. And if you got your energy from a cleaner source, such as nuclear, or even better, a renewable source like solar or wind, people could drive around in their electric cars as much as they would like, and they would not in any way contribute to CO2 being released into the atmosphere. Another solution is to build next-gen high-speed rails. Many nations like Japan or France have high-speed rails that are way ahead of the US, for instance. Traveling by train is one of the most energy-efficient things anyone can do. And it's also relatively cheap. There's a reason why transporting freight by train is very much preferred, if it's possible, compared to flying. Now imagine if you had a next-gen high-speed railroad line connecting all parts of the US. Way fewer people would fly, which would satisfy people like Greta, and for the most part there wouldn't be a need to fly. Finally, we can enforce new building codes to demand better insulation of buildings in the temperate zone, as well as buildings that are designed to be naturally cooled in warmer latitudes. It's amazing what we can do now these days with new building materials. And we can cut down greatly on emissions by simply making homes more energy efficient. Like I said, all the things I mentioned so far are pretty simple solutions that are very much doable and can be done in a very short time period, and would actually have a major effect. Would it fix everything? Of course not, because emissions are not a simple problem to solve. But it would at least be a great start. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Anyway, I'm gonna head off now and work on the next video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care, guys. Bye.